Okay, cool. I can't hear you, so if you just want to wave at me in the chat if there are any tech problems, that would be fab. But wonderful to be joining everyone today. My name is Clover Hogan. I am a 21-year-old climate activist. I research climate anxiety and how we respond to big existential challenges like climate change on a kind of mental and emotional level. And I'm also the founder and executive director of Force of Nature. So we are a launch pad to really help Gen Z, help my generation step up rather than shut down in the face of the climate crisis. So the issue that we really exist to take on is one of powerlessness. So we're here to support people to shift from a place of feeling really overwhelmed and really burdened by climate change to a place where people feel empowered to take action and have a real sense of their kind of agency and efficacy. And so I'd love to kick off makes you feel. So if you want to go ahead and enter into the chat box, what feelings kind of climate change evokes for you? Just go ahead and share with your fellow peers how climate change really makes you feel. Oh, I'm being told you can't hear me. Okay, back again. Good to know. All right, cool. So go ahead and share how climate change really makes you feel. And in the meantime, I'm going to be sharing more of the agenda for today's session. So we're really going to be unpacking something called eco-anxiety, which some of you will be familiar with, which relates to some of the kind of normal reactions to climate change around overwhelm and anxiety and fear. And we're also going to be talking about something called ecophobia, which I'm presuming most of you haven't heard of. So I'm going to leave that one as a bit of a surprise. We're going to be talking about why we respond to big threats like climate change in the way that we do. And we're also going to be going through a quick kind of activity to begin to draw awareness to the feelings that climate change evokes. So without further ado, eco-anxiety really relates to feelings of overwhelm, anxiety, stress, fear, grief that come up in the face of climate change. So Friends of the Earth did some research last year that showed that upwards of 70% of 18 to 24-year-olds in the UK were feeling eco-anxious. And this very much reflects the same research that we've conducted at Force of Nature with students from every corner of the world, from Nicaragua to Jakarta, Tel Aviv to New York City. Lots of young people really sharing their kind of existential dread in the face of climate change. And it also reflects what I've heard working in classrooms across the UK. So, you know, I've worked with 8 and 9-year-olds who, when asked to describe the future, depict something out of a kind of dystopian blockbuster with empty supermarket shelves and cities underwater, you know, a planet in decline, the kind of place no one really wants to find waiting for them when they grow up. And it's very different from the future that that my parents envisioned when I asked them about the world that they saw at our age. You know, it's one of kind of flying cars and deadly disease being eradicated. So there's this real generational shift in how we're feeling about the future that we're actually inheriting. But for a long time, I tried to suppress my own eco-anxiety because I thought that it was a weakness. You know, I thought it was something that I had to kind of beat into submission. And yet with time, I realized that that eco-anxiety, those feelings were actually in some way my superpower. I worked with a number of kind of climate psychologists who would now argue that feeling eco-anxious is a perfectly natural kind of human response to climate change. What it really indicates is that you care, that you have a lot of empathy about the issues, you know, that they grate something against your morals, your ethics, your sense of self. And so the challenge here isn't then how to kind of suppress those feelings of eco-anxiety, but how to channel them in a way that is really constructive and that also contributes to your own sense of agency rather than your own sense of overwhelm. And so that's where this word ecophobia comes in. So ecophobia is kind of close cousin to eco-anxiety and relates specifically to the feeling of powerlessness. So eco-anxiety relates to the kind of overwhelm, anxiety, stress, the things that catalyze us to act. And ecophobia refers to that state at which we actually shut down, when it just becomes a bit too much. And why this is an important kind of differentiator is that we see that when we don't have a clear sense of what we can do as individuals in collective, that's when it can kind of tip into the powerlessness and the sort of despair and nihilism of, it's way too big. And that's when we also start coming into the stories that we subscribe to about ourselves that really disempower us and stop us from taking action in a meaningful way. And we're going to get into those stories in a moment, but before we do, I'd love us to unpack a little further what really contributes to these feelings of overwhelm and powerlessness. So in terms of the research that we've conducted at Force of Nature, we've identified that this ecophobia really distills down to 3 core buckets. So the first bucket relates to human psychology. So the first reason we really find it difficult to take action on climate change is because, we humans are wired to respond to sudden, intimate attacks. So when a tiger leapt at us from the bush for our ancestors, it triggered a kind of fight or flight response. And the same goes for when someone on an e-scooter swerves toward me on the sidewalk. But it's a little different when it comes to climate change, right? Because it's this huge kind of nebulous challenge. And, it doesn't necessarily activate those defensive mechanisms. The other thing that a big overwhelming challenge can create in us is, kind of denial mechanisms as well. So we see that especially in older generations, the folks of my parents' era, where that denial shows up in this kind of blind optimism or techno-utopianism, which is trust that, robots will save the day or young people will deliver the solutions, even if we're not currently being supported or empowered to. So we see that there are like lots of different responses across this kind of generational spectrum that relate to why climate psychology purely on an instinctual, intuitive level suggests that this is a really hard challenge to take action on. The second kind of bucket of why we find it so hard to step up relates to cultural narratives. So cultural narratives being the kind of stories that we subscribe to about the world. We can think about cultural narratives really being kind of divided into 2 core areas. And we can think of these areas by way of values that are encouraged or cultivated. So we have extrinsic values and we have intrinsic values. So extrinsic values relate to things like comparison, competition, really anything that encourages us to determine our values based on what's happening around us or what people think of us. Whereas intrinsic values relate to things like contribution, connection, community. And so we can see how things, cultural narratives, things happening outside of us perpetuate those extrinsic values. So for example, if I'm on social media and I'm scrolling, I'm constantly being shown images of people who are perfectly photoshopped and beautiful, and I'm constantly being told this message that I'm not pretty enough or smart enough or good enough. And then equally, I'm constantly being inundated with advertising that really forces me to think that I will never be good enough until I buy that thing or have that thing. And Global Action Plan has done some incredible work around looking at the impact of advertising, especially in social media, on young people, which I really encourage you to check out. And then we also have things like the education system. There are lots of great things about our education system in the UK, but equally, it is the echo of a system that was born in the Industrial Revolution that really encouraged us to become a set of averages in many ways. And it is still very much embedded in this kind of competitive mindset where you're constantly comparing yourself to your peers, your value is constantly being graded against quite an arbitrary scale. And lots of young people go through that system and leave it feeling like they've never had the opportunity to really discover where they are smartest, to unpack, what unique skills and talents and passions that they bring to the table. And so we can see here that, education is currently asking young people, which careers they want to go to rather than which problems they want to solve in the world. And so we can see the impact that that education system also has, from kind of drawing us towards some of those extrinsic values rather than the intrinsic ones of, but actually, what's my legacy going to be? What are the problems I want to take on, and how can I do so in community? And then the third bucket, after human psychology, after these cultural narratives, really relates to the stories that we subscribe to about ourselves, so our self-limiting beliefs. And these stories show up in lots of different ways, but we all have them, whether it's I'm too small to make a difference, or the future is something happening to me, not something I have control over. Or by far the one that I've heard most frequently, both in boardrooms, working with business leaders, or working with young people in the classroom, is that the system is too broken to create meaningful change, and I am powerless to change it. These stories really get in the way of us being able to take action, because they facilitate our apathy, they facilitate our inaction. And so we need to begin to rewrite these stories. Now, I believe that the threat, even greater than climate change, is the feeling of powerlessness in the face of it. If we don't have an empowered population to take on these huge challenges, how can we expect to deliver the solutions? Who will deliver the solutions? And on the flip side of that, I believe, having now worked in the climate space for about 10 years, that the most underutilized, powerful tool that we have is that of mindset. And so I would argue that, whether you believe that you're not smart enough or experienced enough, if that's one of the stories, or that you feel it's too late, or you feel that the challenge is too great, or you feel that you're not supported to take action, I would bring objective awareness to each of those stories and begin to reshape them, because your ability to shape your own story is the greatest tool that you have to shape the story outside of you, to shape the story that we all subscribe to shape the cultural narratives that we all subscribe to. And so what I would like to do in our remaining 7 or so minutes is actually reflect on some of these stories. So we're going to go through a 3-step process. And the first question that I have for you, and please do share your answers in the chat as well, is I want you to identify the story that keeps you feeling smallest or trapped in this kind of anxiety cloud. Chances are you have a few stories, so just pick one that really resonates with you. And some examples could be, I'm not smart enough or experienced enough to solve these problems. I hear that a lot working with young people. It's definitely one I've had to overcome as someone who entered into this space at a really early age. The second one is, could be the system is too broken to create meaningful change. The third story could be, I don't know where to start. But I just want us to take a minute now to really reflect on what some of those stories are. So I'll give you 30 seconds or so just in reflection. Okay, thank you for sharing. So we're going to go to the second question now, which is identifying what we need to do to challenge this story. So I want you to ask yourself, having identified that story that keeps you feeling a bit anxious or that keeps you feeling small, that story that limits your own potential, what would need to happen to reveal this story for what it is? And I want you to kind of frame it as a goal. Now, as per our conversation around everything really being centered around the internal and the mindset, I don't want the goal to be framed as something that would need to happen outside of your control. You know, some change happening on climate, or some politician making a decision, or some business leader shifting. I really want you to think on a personal level, what would you need to do to challenge your own story? And I have a few examples again. So, you know, for example, if your story was, you know, I'm not smart enough or experienced enough, perhaps the goal then becomes understand what skills I have that I can use to create change. Okay. If your story was about the system being too broken, perhaps your goal is to reframe climate change as an opportunity to create a better, brighter world, and to focus on the solutions that exist rather than giving all of your energy to the problems. If your story was I don't know where to start, then it could be that your goal to challenge this story is to find the focus of a single problem rather than feeling overwhelmed by the scale of climate change. So we're going to take another minute or so to reflect on what some of these goals actually look like. Okay, thank you for that. And now we're going to shift on to the third question. So now that you've identified one of those stories that keeps you feeling small or trapped in that kind of anxiety, and then as we've reframed it as a kind of challenge, you know, what would I need to do to shake up this story in my own life with my own mindset? I want our final question to be around what that first step could look like. And I'd like to frame it as a bit of a commitment. So, what's one thing that you can do today to work toward this goal? So, if your story was about not being smart enough or experienced enough to solve these problems, and your goal was around to understand what skills you have to really bring to this challenge, potentially your first step could look like something like I will make a list of my top 3 skills where I'm smartest, or the things that come as easy as breathing, and brainstorm how I can use these skills to take action on the issues that I care about. If your story was around the system being too broken and your goal was to really focus on the solutions, potentially your first step, your first commitment could be to research 3+ solutions that exist to take on climate change today. Finally, if your story was something like, I don't know where to start, then your challenge could have been to find the focus of a single problem. And your first step could look like getting clear on the one issue, the one problem that you care about most deeply, the thing that ignites that fire beneath your skin. And as you reflect on these commitments, on those first steps, I'd love you to think about a bit of a goal in terms of time. So I would suggest framing it for the end of this day. You could do it by the end of the Youth Climate Summit, but really make yourself responsible, because in making yourself responsible, you're actually claiming that power. You're shifting from that place of powerless to empowered. Every time we make climate change someone else's responsibility, we give a little bit of that power away. But in assuming responsibility and saying, actually, I do have the skills and talents, and I do have the energy to take on these challenges, that's when we claim that power back. So I encourage you to keep coming back to these questions and to really focus on this idea that, you know, while we might not be able to think our way into new ways of acting, we certainly can act our way into new ways of thinking. So in taking those first steps, you are taking the first steps to actually shape your own mindset, shape your ability to show up and solve the problems. So that's all from me for today. I wish you a brilliant summit. I'm super excited to hear everything that comes out of it. Please do feel free to get in touch at any point. You can find me at Clover Hogan on Instagram and Twitter. You can find us at forceofnature.xyz, and you can also find us at that link on Instagram too. So really look forward to hearing from you, and best of luck today, guys.